Welcome back to the workbench. In the previous part of this build, I constructed the engine for the 1/24 scale Hellcat. In this part, I'm going to be completing the final assembly, so we're almost there. Hello everyone, I'm Matt and this is Model Minutes. And join me for part 5 of the 1/24 scale Grumman Hellcat from Airfix. Let's get into this. In part 4, I got as far as completing the engine assembly and adding that onto the aircraft that I've built so far. So it's starting to almost look exactly where we need it to be. But in this episode, we just need to get all those final bits of plastic glued onto the plane. As usual, I'm going to pop a list of the products I used on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go and get if you fancy having a go at this one for yourself. I'm not going to go into detail on how I cut and clean up the parts because I've already covered that in previous episodes. I'm just going to crack straight on. So here I've got the various panels which are going to be added onto the aircraft, and they need to have their internal areas painted in the same interior green. I've almost used the entire bottle though, so I do thin this down. Both of these are from Outlaw Paints. It was a simple matter just to spray all of these parts internally with this colour. Next up is some RAF beige green. Again thinned down as I am running out of this paint, having used almost an entire bottle on this build. This was sprayed onto the external surfaces of the lower parts of the panels, as well as any other components which are still waiting to be added to the aircraft. These include elements of the tail wheel. With that done, some of these panels can start to be installed. I decided on the lower side of the plane that I actually wanted to have the vents in an open position, but you could glue them closed if you wanted to. There are a couple of support braces which need to be glued into place on the engine in order to prevent the panels from being misaligned. These had already been painted with the green colour, were glued into place, and then the lower panel added. You might notice that there are some gaps in places, and this sort of stems from that snowballing effect I've mentioned in previous episodes, where if the fit isn't quite perfect, later on the gaps may become a little bit larger. Dark sea grey from Outlaw Paints was then loaded into the airbrush and painted onto the upper surfaces of the panels that required it. You can see that on some of the panels I've actually sketched out in a pencil which parts need to have this paint on. I'm hoping that when I add them onto the aircraft, all of the camouflage lines will actually match up. After this, the dark slate grey that I used on the camouflage scheme was repeated on the panels so that the camouflage scheme could be blended in. And with that done, it was time to add the panels that I wanted to include. So on the starboard side of the aircraft, I've actually decided that the majority of the panels will be in place. All I did was simply add some glue and install these into the relevant areas. This was a little fiddly at times, but I made sure that each panel was in place before moving on to the next one. Again, there are some more little strut components which need to be glued into place to help support the panels. I'm not sure all of these struts are needed, but if you're leaving some panels off, you definitely need them to be there. So returning back to the starboard side, these panels were added, having already had the relevant camouflage colours applied to them. The engine vents here can actually be positioned open or closed. I decided I'd like this one to be in an open position. Outlaw Satin Clear lacquer paint was next to be used, and this was airbrushed onto all of these panels to help bring the finish in line with the rest of the aircraft. Also, there are a couple of decals that still need to be applied. As with the previous episode where I applied decals, I'm using Microset and Microsol as my setting solution. The decals on the nose of the aircraft were applied in exactly the same way that I've covered in a previous video. There are a few little stencils and things that I had to take a little bit of care to get in the right places. After the decals had been left to cure, some more satin clear was sprayed over the top to seal them in and protect them from any weathering that I may do in the next episode. Now it's time to turn my attention to the propeller. Outlaw Yellow was used to paint the tips of the blade, as well as the central spinner part. Outlaw Black makes a reappearance here, and having masked the centre of the spinner and the tips, the remainder of the propeller was sprayed in this colour. Whilst I've got this colour out, I'm also going to paint all of the wheels. You can see that I've already masked the tail wheel with one of the masks that came with the Eduard set previously used. With that done, I removed the masks and they seem to have done a pretty good job. This black paint is pretty smooth already, so I didn't see the point in adding any satin clear. There are some transfers that need to go onto the propeller, so they were just applied in the exact same manner I've already used. And when that was done, some Outlaw Flat Clear was airbrushed onto the propeller and the tyres. This should help dull down any glossiness, and in the case of the propeller, protect the transfers from any handling. For the centres of the wheels, some Ammo MIG aluminium was loaded into the airbrush and then sprayed onto these areas. I also used this on the pitot tube. And talking about the pitot tube, other than the part I've already painted in aluminium, which was suitably masked, the rest of it was given a quick coat of Outlaw Red. Now it's time to assemble the main wheels. These hubs will only go in one way due to the design of the hubs. This was a simple process, and then they could be glued onto the relevant landing gear legs. There is a slightly flattened edge on one side, so I made sure that lined up with the ground, to simulate the weight of the aircraft pushing down on the tyre. The tailwheel assembly was built following the instructions, and this was a fairly simple process. It was a little fiddly at times though, given the number of parts and the small contact areas between them. Once that was done, it was carefully installed into the relevant position inside the tail of the aircraft. You'll remember from a previous episode that I put in the panels for the gun bays as masking elements. Here I'm going to remove them. I did have to clean up some of the sticky tack that I'd left inside to make sure that they didn't move. There is a bracing component which goes across the gun bay. This was glued into place, having previously been painted the same interior green colour. Once that was done, the correct gun bay door was glued into the relevant position. Again, these have already been painted with the relevant transfers applied. On the bottom of the wing, I glued the pitot tube into its hole, and now I can turn my attention to a clear part. Some Humbrol Clear Fix was used to glue the landing light into position in its relevant hole on the leading edge of the left wing. There are a couple more clear parts which need to be added to the top of the aircraft as well. Underneath the aircraft there are some, I think they're like navigation lights, and these were painted with Humbrol Red, Orange and Lime. I did have to take care here to try and avoid getting this paint in any errant places, but this was a relatively straightforward and simple task. Once that was done, the clear glazing was glued into the holes for these lights. Now it's time to turn my attention to the bombs. These come in a number of components and you do get a few different choices. I think you get £500 bombs and £1,000 bombs. I decided I wanted to go for the £1,000 bombs. You do get rockets included as well, but they are more suitable for the American version, as I believe the British version would have used RP3s and these are not included in the kit. So I'm just going to settle for some bombs. There is also a drop tank if memory serves, but I'm not going to bother including that one. I did have to use some putty surfacer to tidy up some of the gaps on these bombs, and once that was dry I sanded them smooth. Humbrol 155 Olive Drab from a rattle can was simply sprayed onto these bombs. This is actually the colour recommended by the painting instructions. There are some transfers that need to be applied to these bombs as well, and again this was done in exactly the same method as I've used throughout this build. I then carefully installed these onto their pylons, which were already part of the build from a much earlier episode. I then carefully removed the masking tape that's been protecting the cockpit this entire time, and then carefully peeled away all the Eduard masks which are protecting the windscreen. The sliding part of the canopy was placed onto the aircraft, but it's not going to be glued in until the next episode. Again, this was painted in a previous episode and the masks have simply been peeled off. I also dry fit the propeller onto the shaft on the engine, as I'll need to do some work to this in the next episode as well. And with that, I called this part of the build complete. And there we have it. So this build is primarily done. It is pretty much finished to an absolutely basic standard. However, in the next episode, I'll be adding some weathering and finishing touches to just add a little bit of extra weight and realism to the aircraft. I don't think I'll overdo it, but I will try and see if I can just make this look ever so slightly more realistic. I think this was the most trouble-free part of the build and also the most satisfying because we're there. We are so close to being done with this one. Given that I've had all of those sort of funny fit issues where things just haven't quite gone together from previous parts and it's sort of snowballing, actually now I'm starting to feel very positive about it because it's starting to look like the real thing. So make sure you stick around for the next episode where I'll be wrapping up this build with some finishing touches. But for now though, it's time to give my Model Club members a shout out for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them or support the channel in other ways, take a look at the links in the description. The best way to support this channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. From me today at the workbench though, it's time to say a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you here again very soon. What are we doing? Hellcat part 5, take 1. Getting there, getting so close. And join me for part 5 of the 1/24th scale Airfix. God's sake. Airfix.